Hey everyone, welcome back to JLXP. Sorry about missing the Thursday episode drop, but I did know that the LEC and LCS All-Pros were going to be coming out Friday, and I wanted to be able to react to those, talk about them a little bit, and add them to the episode since 10 Thoughts this week was 6 Thoughts, and I didn't think would necessarily make that great of a standalone podcast, so I'm merging the two and releasing a little late. Hopefully, people still have a chance to check this out either Friday or Saturday before the games, or especially if they're there for the All-Pro discussions, that's going to be a little more evergreen. So I did want to start with the All-Pro results. So the people that haven't found them yet, I'll go through the LCS ones mainly. I'll kind of touch on the LEC ones, but I'll go through the people who won the LCS awards and then also what I voted and how I differ from the consensus. So for those of you who don't know how the ballot is actually done, this has been a system since, I believe, 2017 when voting became public. It has roughly a third, a little bit more than a third of like pro votes, which every LCS team is going to have a pro player representative submit a ballot and a coaching staff representative submit a ballot. So that's going to combine to 20 ballots. Then there's a third party section, and then there's kind of a broadcast team / Riot section. And the reason for this is to account for biases that are always going to exist. And there's definitely different views out there about who is right in each situations. And I don't necessarily think any of them are right all the time. So if we're going to talk about pro players, they're going to have the best firsthand experience playing against an opponent. But that is going to be much more inconsistent than, say, my opinion as a caster who's watching every game from every team. The majority of pro players do not watch every game of LCS. So what I think their ballots are mostly influenced by is the experience they had playing against a player, mostly on stage, but also it's impossible to remove the experience they had playing against that player in scrims. So that's part of why I think you also see some inconsistency in the pro ballots, because if a player destroyed you on stage, you're going to think they're good. And if you destroyed them on stage, you're going to think they're not as good. And if you factor that over 18 games, it could just be that guy having a good or a bad game, but for the individual voting, it's going to feel different. All in all, it's supposed to balance out to give a pretty balanced view. And I think, generally speaking, I'm not offended by this ballot. So I'll go through the actual results. So the first team, LCS All-Pro, was everyone on EG except for Impact. So it is Someday in the top lane from 100 Thieves, then Inspired, Jojo Pune, Danny, and Vulcan. This is what I expected. This was my ballot as well for first team. I thought Someday just had such a tremendous performance this split that he deserved first team. I think the most controversial one is going to be Jojo. And by the voting, it was. He only got 87 points, which is the lowest amount of points of anyone who made the All-Pro team. The way points are defined as well is a first-place vote gives you 3 points, a second-place vote gives you 2 points, a third-place vote gives you 1 point, and winning a player of the game gives you the equivalent of a first-place vote in points, which is 3 points as well. But yeah, Jojo is the lowest because I think mid is by far the most controversial position, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Inspired, I think, is going to win the MVP. He had the most points by far, 127. Danny, I think, finally got his due. This is definitely a little bit influenced by last split, even if people are going to say that it's just his performance in this split, because I think he was largely, largely the same player, maybe slightly improved from spring, where he didn't even make it to a top 3 team. It was FBI, I don't remember the order exactly, but Hans Sama, FBI, and Berserker, who were first team in spring, and Danny slingshotted them all to get first place. But I think because EG was able to win the title, and also because they just won more games as a team, people really appreciated the reliability that is Danny. When he gets gold, he is going to carry the game. But in terms of his actual stats, he led the league in kills in 2021 summer and 2022 spring, much like he did this split, but actually by not as much. The main thing that he stood out with this split was actually his DPM, where I believe he set an LCS record. It was about 780 DPM, which is 180 higher than the next closest player. So really overperformed in teamfights, but like, I do think a lot of that is actually influenced by people looking at him differently when they're making these judgments, and that is influenced by the past. So All-Pro second team here was Impact, Closer, Bjergsen, Berserker, and Core JJ. My second team is actually very different. So most of the players that made All-Pro second team, I had as third team votes. So I actually put Impact, Bjergsen, Berserker, and Core JJ all as third team. The only second team vote that matched me was Closer. But I don't necessarily disagree with the result here. I saw a lot of comments specifically targeted at Core JJ, and people are saying he gets by on name recognition. First off, him and Huhi are very close in points. It was 57-52, so most people think it is a toss-up between the two. And I think what people underestimate with Core JJ is how much he influences other players in the game. So when I look at the ballot here, and if you're going to say, like, if we're going to take the approach that Core JJ is like a brand name, then I don't necessarily think, or like a narrative pick, the majority of the casters actually put him third team. Whereas when you're looking at a lot of the pro team votes, players and coaches, that's where you see Core JJ in a lot of first teams and a lot of second teams. And that's not just because these pro players are like, oh yeah, Core JJ used to be good. It's because even though he did have off games and he's not the MVP Core JJ that was there in years past, he still, like, I guess the best way of putting this is he is the influence for how so many North American supports look at the game and try and play the game. And Core JJ still does a lot of those things very well. So he may not be as effective as he used to be, but that's because so many of these players have just studied Core JJ to try and figure out how he makes so many correct decisions and how he finds so many good angles in game. So he's been doing it for a long time and probably is looking to innovate to find a little bit more success, but he's still extremely good and clearly still extremely difficult to play against. Dignitas, EG, 100 Thieves, and FlyQuest, all these teams put Core JJ on their first team. EG obviously can't put Vulcan on their first team, but still obviously a lot of respect from them. But that's just a little bit on Core JJ. I think Berserker is similar, where his stats are not necessarily that great, but playing against him, he must just feel impossible to kill and is always doing maximum damage in teamfights, and you can see that in the mechanics. Bjergsen in mid, also the second lowest number of points for people on second team. Closer's the one I agree with. I think he had a super solid split. Going to third team, the third team that was voted in was Bwipo, Santorin, Takui, FBI, and Huhi. So I believe I've talked about all my votes. For those of you who want to know how to find the votes, I'll link it in the description. Every year that the All-Pro votes are released, also everyone's voting results are linked at the bottom of that article. That's true now for LCS and LEC. But to talk about third team a little bit, I think the most important discussion point, since jungle and top are pretty clear cut about who the three should be, with Someday, Impact, and Bwipo, and then jungle is Inspired, Closer, and Santorin. Mid is where I think it goes like 5 or 6 deep. So Takui wasn't actually on my ballot. I put Abadaga as my second team. Abadaga didn't make top 3. And then another player who I think in a different year or with different circumstances could easily make the All-Pro and is still playing at a very high level is Jensen. I actually think, looking at the ballot, the most robbed player is Jensen. Like, I'm scanning down these lists of mid lanes and I see Riot Games stats voted Jensen second team. Scanning up, I see Golden Guardians player vote, Licorice voted Jensen. TSM player vote voted Jensen. These are all second team. And then third team, he gets very little love as well. And that's because there are 5 or 6 players that are very deserving of a top 3 vote. The 5 I just mentioned, as well as Palafox, who I think had a breakthrough split. But, like, Jensen led the league in kills. He did miss having his bot lane for the first 3 games, and they lost a few. he had a couple really bad games, which I think influenced him really negatively. Specifically, week 7, he had 2 bad games, but he was almost player of the week in week 6 and had 2 absolutely incredible games in week 8. Like, the amount of games that Jensen carried was actually very high. He ended with more kills than any other mid laner, still put out a large amount of damage in team fights. Like, he's still a very good player, but is just like not even sniffing votes. So I think mid is going to be the hardest and the most unjust because there's so many justifications. Like, you can make a very good case for Takui to be first team, even though he didn't end up on my ballot, because when he is on, like, he was carrying FlyQuest to victory. Part of that is reflected by the fact that he won the most player of the game awards of any other mid laner. And then you look at a guy like Bjergsen, who was incredibly consistent, didn't necessarily feel like he was the reason the team was winning that many games, but was never the reason they were losing. And then if you look at his stats, they are all awesome. He's pumping out damage in team fights. He has good laning. He has the most solo kills for mid laners. He's doing a lot. But he didn't have the same really high highs that even like Abadaga had, who didn't even make it to the top 4. So you can see mid is a mess. And just kind of to recap, the top 3 mids was Jojo first, Bjergsen second, Takui third. I would need to tally up to see, but I believe Abadaga would have been 4th, Jensen would have been 5th, and Palafox would have been 6th. Those would have been all the players receiving votes. But that's just kind of a quick overview on the All-Pro. I think there's a lot of discussion and debate that is definitely better done with other people to debate it with. So talk about it with your friends, talk about it on Reddit, talk about it on Twitter and the YouTube comments. Also can talk briefly about the LEC ones because there's definitely a lot of controversy I've seen from that. I didn't do a ballot for LEC, so I haven't thought about this deeply. But the controversy here is that they had 4 Mad Lions players and then Broken Blade. So Elyoya, Niski, Unforgiven, and Kaiser, and then Broken Blade as first team. Elyoya actually has the most points, more so than Niski. So it's going to be really interesting to see who ends up winning the MVP, whether it is Elyoya or Niski. Generally speaking, you will usually see the MVP be the player who most unanimously got first place in their player votes. It's already been voted for. They just haven't released the results yet, so I don't know what it's going to be. Then there's a big debate I've been seeing about Niski for MVP versus, Caps is actually the better player, where you see G2 actually ended in first place, and there was also discussion that the second team All-Pro for LEC could beat the first team All-Pro for LEC. I think a lot of this comes down to the motivations or belief you have in what you're actually voting for. Because first or second team All-Pro, for me, is about who had the best individual performance across the 18 games of this split. However, it's very easy to look at it as who was the best player this season, which varies a bit, right? Because it depends on consistency. It depends on how high your highs were. It depends on did this player need to perform at this level in order to push this team over the top versus just a raw level of performance. And I think depending on how you look at it, the ballot is definitely going to look different. And this applies even more when we get down to what constitutes the most valuable player. A lot of people see it as best player, but how do you really consider the player's value? Niski's narrative is very strong. He's also a very good player. Mad Lions went from 8 wins to 12 wins, with the change being Niski. It would also be really flippin' hilarious if you think about Niski's past. He was the mid laner when Svenskeren won MVP. He was the mid laner when Blabber won MVP. And if he's the mid laner when Elyoya wins MVP, you gotta wonder, how much is this guy doing to enable his jungler versus just dumb luck of playing with the best junglers that year? Knowing the history is absolutely going to impact the way people vote for the future. So knowing that, at least for the people that are paying attention, he enables his junglers so well and hadn't gotten credit for it in the past, it almost feels like he's due. So I would definitely not be surprised if Niski wins, and I wouldn't think that it's undeserving either. Because you can make an argument that Elyoya had a better individual split, looking at the numbers or looking at the impact he was able to have in games, taking out the context of what he looked like in spring, or what Niski's past junglers ended up looking like with or without Niski. But that context does matter because you're trying to take in as much information as possible to judge an individual player's performance. So that's my prediction. I don't know the results of any of this. I think Niski will win LEC MVP, but it's going to be a really interesting vote because they had a really topsy-turvy split. I'm going to talk quickly about my 10 Thoughts article as well. So this week I only did 6 thoughts, so I shouldn't call it a 10 Thoughts article. It was the top 6 teams, and they're very brief thoughts on EG and 100 Thieves because they don't play this week. We only have 2 matchups this week. It is TL versus FlyQuest and CLG versus C9. EG and 100 Thieves both have buys, and then on Thursday and Friday, actually, the losers of the matchups that are played this week will go and play TSM and Golden Guardians. So those are the matchups I'm going to more be previewing in next week's article and next week's Thoughts episode. It's going to have to come out earlier, though, because the games are actually on Thursday. But going into this weekend, I think TL versus FlyQuest is a really interesting, almost like class battle in the fact that this isn't written in the article, but in the fact that TL had such massive expectations, such a large budget this year, and FlyQuest really had to go at it in a completely different direction. You look at their 2-star players, Jose Diodo and Takui, and they're both players from minor regions. They both count as import slots, but they're not your traditional European or Korean imports. They had to look where other people weren't necessarily looking because they weren't able to attract or afford the top imports from other regions. And then they still have their own bit of development story. They have the NA support in Aframu. He's played 10 years in the LCS. He's incredibly experienced. They brought him in because Johnson wanted to play with him again. And they brought in a rookie in Philip who hasn't performed amazingly but has been getting the job done. I don't expect them to win, but the odds are definitely stacked against them when they play against kind of the behemoth that is TL. And for TL, I do wonder, like, how winning... This is the tricky thing with me with TL, is it doesn't feel like they can get a win in a emotional sense, because every time they do win, it's as if they were expected to because of the players. And every time they lose, they're kind of set up for this failure. So it's really hard to like intrinsically motivate yourself when you're in that situation. I think that's probably a small part of why they've been struggling. But with that being said, like last week was very good for them. I think they probably have turned a corner. They should be able to overpower FlyQuest in a lot of these early games. And I think we'll have to play quite below their level in order to lose that series. So I haven't made my final prediction yet, but I'm definitely favoring TL. I just haven't decided if it should be a 3-0 or a 3-1 prediction. The other series, C9 versus CLG, is one of those series where I really want CLG to win because of the way the regular season went. I spent so much time during the regular season doubting CLG, and even preseason, so many people predicted them so low that they've been defying these expectations week after week. Oh, they only beat bad teams in week 1. Boom, they beat EG. Later on, they take a game off of EG as well. TL as well. And they amassed a lot of quality wins in order to actually get side selection in this series against C9, which will be relatively important because CLG is a much better red side team than they are blue side team. They're 7-2 on red side. C9 is also similar. I think they prefer red side, so this could be a series where they bounce back and forth, both taking red side. But for C9, when I look at them, even though they haven't performed at a super high level, they've always had pretty good excuses, like the fact that they didn't have their bot lane for the first week, or the fact that they didn't have any time to practice. And when they look good, they look really good. Like in terms of the amount of talent or potential on a team versus what was consistently realized on stage, there's the biggest gap there for C9. So traditionally you think when playoffs happen, that's when they are able to put it together and throughout a best of 5 series would not be beaten. But it would also kind of invalidate so much of what COG has built this year in defying expectations. Because if they go straight into the series and get swept by C9, that's really disappointing as a person who's been following their story, because it would almost reaffirm all the things that people have been saying about them the whole split, that they didn't deserve to be there or that they didn't have enough talent. I do think they have made improvements, but I just really hope that they put up a good showing in this series, is kind of what I'm saying, because it allows for deeper story building and more belief in the future when teams pop up like this. I wrote about this part in the article. There are two different versions of this COG team. If we look into the recent past, I'd say the 2020 version of FlyQuest was viewed in somewhat of a similar way, where they didn't necessarily have the biggest budget roster. They did have Santorin and Power of Evil, but Santorin was still refining his way in the LCS at the time, and you didn't expect them to compete with the big boys, but they actually ended second in spring and second in summer and went 3-3 at Worlds. They were the second best team, or arguably, if you sum up the whole year, the best team in the LCS. Aren't remembered as such, weren't expected as such, but that was the level they performed at. In 2021, I'd say Spring Dignitas would be what COG doesn't want to be here, because Spring Dignitas went 11-7, which gave them 5th seed, but that's also only one shy of what COG accomplished here, which is 4th seed. And they just got demolished as soon as playoffs started and then sucked in summer. So when a team has reached success for the first time in a while, you're naturally always going to question how fleeting it becomes. And for the people that say that the success is deserved, they're just like waiting to be right. And as soon as COG loses, they'll be like, aha! But I think in COG's case right now, that is a little bit unfair, because they have had legitimately good wins and they have made strides. So I guess the long-winded way of saying this is, if they can beat C9 in the series, even if then they didn't make Worlds, for me, it would be an undeniable stamp of success. Right now, even if they lost the series to C9, but like didn't get embarrassed doing so, let's say they lose that, win the losers bracket game, and then just kind of end up not being able to climb over, e.g. 100 Thieves, TL, or C9, I'd still give them credit for a good year. There's just a lot of people that would not. So really, really big weekend for COG versus C9. I think a lot more variance can be expected in this series than in the other one, and it is definitely the one that I'm looking forward to the most. So that's about all I have to say about this weekend. I'm going to be talking about it on broadcast as well, and I'll be doing a larger preview for next week of playoffs, where there's going to be 4 matchups. And again, apologies for the late episode, but I hope you enjoyed some of the insights and thoughts about the different ways that All-Pro can be approached and predictions for MVP, and I hope to see you this weekend. See you next time.